Good day. You are tuned to Radio BVM. I'm Motorman Elwin here in Vacuum Land. Oh, what another wonderful day it is here in the neighborhood. Today is extra special. Why? Because I have sitting across from me someone who could only be best described as a living legend in Vancouver radio. He's been a fixture at CKNW for years. Make that decades. Winner of more awards you can shake a stick at. The Jack Webster Bruce Hutchinson Lifetime Achievement Award. The BC Association of BC Lifetime Achievement Awards amongst broadcasters. Radio TV News Director Association. And the list goes on and on and on. He's turning beet red here, so I better stop. But before I introduce you to him, let me tell you what others have said about him. A quote, while George's ability to break stories was unparalleled, even greater was his integrity. His contacts trusted George completely. In a competitive business that can often get nasty, George earned the respect and friendship of other reporters within this business. Now, George was a competitor without enemies. I'll repeat that again. George was a competitor without enemies, and that is a rare thing indeed. Another quote, if I may. Journalism in Vancouver has dropped considerably now that with the retirement of longtime CKNW reporter George Garrett. Welcome, Mr. Garrett.
Well, thank you very much. Those are wonderful words in the introduction, and you've done your research.
I tried.
That's great.
May I call you George?
Absolutely,
All right.
yeah.
So, how are you enjoying retirement?
I love it very much. I've been retired 14 years now, and so I'm enjoying my family, including our 4 grandchildren, their 2 daughters and their husbands. So
You're very blessed.
we are. And my wife, Joan, we've been married for 56 years, 57th year coming up in October. So it's been a very good family experience for us over the years.
And you've brought your entourage here today as your cheerleading team.
Well, I brought my daughter Lori and my brother Jim and his wife Ann, who
Right.
came in from Kelowna yesterday.
All right.
So they will probably heckle if I say some wrong things.
All right. We'll see if we can avoid that.
Okay.
So before we get into your long career in radio broadcast, let's go back to the beginning, way back to the prairies, if I may. Mm-hmm. Your place of birth.
Born in Mortlach, Saskatchewan, which is a little town 30-some miles west of Moose Jaw. And I was delivered not by a doctor or a nurse, but by a woman who used to be called an assistant at birth, and her name happened to be Mrs. Hi. I never did find out how to spell it. She was a midwife. Uh-huh. But I was delivered in her home in Mortlach, Saskatchewan. But I got my early interest in radio from being in that part of the world, because I would go out to the farm in the summertime with my aunt and my grandmother. And one of my aunts worked for an old fellow named Jack Douglas, who listened to the news, and this was wartime. And we had battery radios in those days, A batteries and B batteries. And he would turn on our local station, CHAB Moose Jaw, to find out who had been killed at war, how the battles were going, who was wounded, and so on. And then right after the news, he would take those clips off the batteries so that I couldn't listen to his radio and wear down his batteries. But that's where I got the idea. At age about 9 or 10, I wanted to be that guy inside the radio. I never forgot it. And I took my first audition when I was 15, and they said, "Nice voice, kid, but go home and try again."
Oh, that must have been kind of hard to take, no?
But then I would carry radio equipment for my guys in CHAB Moose Jaw. I would help them carry the amplifiers out on remotes, go get them coffee, anything to be around the station. Finally, one guy said, I used to be the chief announcer up at CJNB North Battleford, 250 miles away. He said, "Why don't you go up there and tell them you know me?" So I hitchhiked up there, which was my mode of transportation. And the fellow did hire me. And he told me later, he said, "I hired you not because you had a great voice. I hired you because you showed initiative. I knew you really wanted the job." And that got me started, 1952. And within months, I met Joan, the gal that I would eventually marry,
Still
mother of our 3 children and grandmother to 4 others now. So it was just that initial contact, wartime news. And in those days, in wartime, because the men were away at war, some of the big newscasts on CHAB were done by women. And for some reason, to this day, I can remember one was Eileen Bradley, another was Betty Parks, and I'd forgotten the third one. And to move the calendar up several years, I was working on a story in New Westminster, probably in the 60s, ran across a druggist named Bob Bedard in Medical Arts Pharmacy in New Westminster, who said, my wife came from Moose Jaw and she worked on CHAB. She was on the air. I said, Betty Parks? How did you know? So, small world, you know. So.
How did you get to eventually to
CJN or CHAB? Well, I had a year under my belt at CJNB North Battleford, and it's customary for young people in radio, in those days at least, to try to go to the next station. I sent tapes to Saskatoon, CFQC, and CKOM.
What kind of tapes are we talking here?
Reading commercials, reading newscasts. It was rip and read, we called it in those days. And a very nice manager a program manager at CHQM Saskatoon, CFQC Saskatoon, excuse me, wrote me a beautiful letter. And he said, here's what you're doing wrong. You're letting your voice drop at the end of sentences. Try and improve on that. Try and improve on your diction. Turns out I wound up working for him back in North Battleford for quite a few years after that. So he was a really good man. What I found over the years that so many good people in the industry who will give a hand up to a kid and give them some encouragement. And one of my big breaks was knowing a fellow at CHAB Moose Jaw, who was my program director, named Bob Giles. And I was heading out to the coast on vacation with my older brother, and he said, you want a job out at CKNW? Oh, I said, that's pretty big for me. He said, I'll put in a word for you, which he did. And they hired me at age 21, which was very, very unusual.
Were they not taking a chance on you, though?
Yeah, they were. But Giles had recommended me, and so they did hire me, and I really enjoyed a career in news. I hadn't been specifically in news before. I'd done some newscasts, but this was totally involved in the news business. So I was out in news cruisers. And the first nighttime news cruiser that was sponsored was the Sunbeam Bred Radio News Cruiser.
What decade are we talking now?
1958. Yeah. We used to have kids in Saffordton that would go down their hill on a bicycle or on a wagon, and one of them would yell, George Garrett, Sunbeam Bred Radio News Cruiser, down the hill.
This is out by Saffordton.
Yeah.
Wow. Let's we don't have a lot of time, but let's talk about some of the highlights of your career as you look back. What would you say are some of the big highlights?
Covering major stories, I think, would be a highlight for me.
I know you were involved in the L.A. riots.
Yes.
I understand you even got injured there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was injured. I was given a call by my program director, Doug Rutherford, who said, George, I think you need some time in the California sun. I knew what he meant. Go down and cover the Rodney King riots. This is the man who'd been beat up by police, caught on video, and the police a year later were given a slap on the wrist, and the black community went absolutely nuts. I don't blame them. And they rioted. So after the first night, I arrived just as they were continuing rioting in night two. And it was so bad, they had put in a curfew, and I couldn't go anywhere except to a hotel. And even then I would sneak out on the street and interview people and come back and file a story. Next morning the curfew was lifted, and the Bill Good show on CKNW wanted to know if I could find out what the churches were doing. And I'd remembered this street called Western Avenue, so I'll go down there. So I drove down Western Avenue in my rented car and pulled into a service station where there was somebody manning the gate, as though it were being kept closed all the time to prevent gas theft, I guess. And there's an old black gentleman there, and I said, I'm looking for a church. And he said, yes, sir. He said, there's one down here, about 2 blocks on the right-hand side. I said, thank you very much. He said, wouldn't go down there if I were you. I said, oh, I'll be all right. Well, I was down there quite a while, filing news reports to our network all over the country. I stayed too long. 4 guys came along, black guys, and they said, that's your car, meaning the rental car? And I said, yes. Give me the keys. I said, no. And I had a tape recorder, notebook, a pen, microphone, keys in the pocket, I guess, but I had my hands full, and I was waiting to go on the air. I'd already set up that I'll be on in 2 minutes. And I said, look, I'm a Canadian reporter. I said, I'm just going on the air to tell the people about your troubles down here. And I said, you wouldn't want to bother with an old guy like me. And he said, doesn't matter how old you are, you're white. And with that, he grabbed the phone and hung it up. And then I tried to hold on to my mic. He pulled it right out of the cord. And then he smacked me probably with the mic in his hand, right in the jaw. And ouch. I went down bleeding. And I guess something frightened them off. They left. And there's a nice man across the street, also a black guy, and he said, you all right? I said, no, I need help. I was bleeding profusely. So he came over, and he said, is that your car? I said, yes. He said, I'm going to drive you to the hospital in your car, and my girlfriend's going to follow me in my car. I said, okay, so I get to the hospital, and I've got my teeth up here. They're big anyway, but they're loose. What I didn't know was I had a broken upper jaw. And I phoned my wife, and I was crying. She ran a hair salon in Surrey, or in Coquitlam. And I was crying on the phone, and she said, what happened? And I said, I got assaulted. She said, where are you? And I said, I'm in the hospital. Which one? I don't know. She said, put down the phone, go to the front desk, ask which hospital you're in, and come back and tell me. And I thought, what presence of mind? You've just been told your husband's hurting, you know. So eventually I got out of there and came home, and my dentist saw me on TV, and he phoned his assistant, and he said, get George in here. He's got a broken jaw. So I have titanium plates up in here now.
So what about when you go through the the airport?
Nothing.
Magnetic.
No, I don't set off the alarm. No.
All right. Let's just go back even before this incident. I know that at one time you were not always doing investigative journalism.
No, I filled in for Roving Mike, for
Right.
Bill Hughes on Roving Mike.
Right.
And then I did just normal reporting. And then I left the station for a few months to go up the trail to run the station, and it didn't work out. I got fired, so I came
Actually,
back.
I do have a quote here for you.
Yeah.
May I read it?
Sure.
Yeah, it goes like this. Now, it was Warren Barker, CKNW, who took George Garrett back after Garrett detoured out of news between 1964 and 1976 and finally got fired as station manager in Trail.
Right.
He came back with tails between my legs. He went to see Warren, whom I idolize. He said, I quote, you have a job and I'll pay you the highest that I can as a newsman.
Yep.
Is that right?
He did. And he also said
Comments.
if you'd like to go somewhere else, to another station, radio or TV, or a newspaper, whatever you want, but you know you've got a job here.
So he took you back.
Yeah. And about a year after that, he decided that he should put me out as a so-called investigative reporter. All that means is, unlike other reporters who have specific assignments to go to, I could go and just cover whatever I wanted. And I made a loose arrangement with him that I wouldn't charge overtime. If I wanted time off sometime, I could take it. But I worked pretty long hours, especially out of town. If you're on an out-of-town assignment, you just go.
Right. Let's talk about some of the other highlights in your career as a broadcaster.
Well, one of them
Anything else comes to mind?
Well, I covered Bill Bennett quite a bit, and Premier Bill Vander Zalm. And I did get a tip. I used to be around the courts a lot, and
This is the one in downtown on...
in Vancouver, New Westminster.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I used to call on police stations all over the place.
All right.
And I never disclosed the source, of course, but I did get a hint from a guy one day about Bill Bennett and his brother Russell were unloading shares of a company called Doman Industries. And simultaneously, a friend I had in the stock market said that there's some insider trading going on with Doman Industries, and the stock is falling, et cetera, et cetera. So I put the two and two together and got enough to do a story. And of course, the Bennetts would never confirm it. But Warren Barker believed in me, and he said, if your facts are right, go ahead, do the story, which I did. And it caused all kinds of problems. I was getting calls from the Toronto Star and the Toronto Telegram. What's your source? I said, you got to be kidding. No way. Never tell him that. But it turned out to be true. You know, he was under investigation. And then I had another one that...
So you must have had to take a deep breath before you let that one divulge.
I was pretty confident.
You were pretty confident.
And then there was another one where I got a tip that Bill Van der Zam was under investigation. And this was a few years later, of course.
That's the Fantasy Garden Tanju with Fei Liang.
Fei Liang and the Fantasy Gardens, at his attempt to sell some of that property to an Asian investor. And I did get a tip that the RCMP were investigating. So I phoned a certain superintendent that I know, and I often would call him about different stories. And with this one, I said, so-and-so, I understand that Premier Van der Zam's under investigation by your guys. There's a long pause, and he said, I have no comment. I said, thank you very much.
That says something, isn't it?
That was enough.
That's enough.
I went with it. And Gary Bannerman was one of our hosts at the time, and he was a friend of Bannerman, a friend of Van der Zam. So he went on the air debunking my own story. And he said, there couldn't be any truth to this. Van der Zam under investigation. It's not true. I'll get Bill on the air here. And he got Van der Zam on. No, Gary, I'm not under investigation. Meanwhile, my boss is saying, stick with your story. Sure enough. Well, he was. And eventually he resigned.
Yeah, that was in the news for months, years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, these stories have a lifetime.
They have legs.
Yeah.
And have legs, yes.
And then I had a police ride-along, which was quite productive. I asked the police department if they would let me do a ride-along for an entire month. And they just about fell off their chair because...
What was that like?
Usually reporters would ask for a ride-along for one shift, maybe two shifts. Mm-hmm. So the chief said, bring your boss in here. That was Warren. So it was Chief Don Winterton and 3 deputies, and Warren and I in a meeting. And what's this all about? And I said, well, I want to show how the police relate to the public. I won't run any tape if somebody calls his sergeant an idiot or anything like that, but I want to know how they deal with the public. So they nodded around the room, and one deputy was not very pleased, but 2 were, and the chief was all for it, so they okayed it. As we were leaving, I said, oh, by the way, sir, I'll be taking along a tape recorder. Oh, a tape recorder? And I said, well, the pencil press, newspaper guys, they use a pencil and a notebook, and I use a tape recorder. Oh, so they okayed it. And one of the things I ran into was sitting in the Vice Squad car one night in front of the old courthouse, which is now the art gallery, Georgia Street. And they were trying to catch a prostitute who would be pressing and persistent, which is the only way they can get a conviction. It's called the Hutt decision, Supreme Court of Canada. And we had an undercover policeman out who happened to be Oriental. He pretended he was a Japanese tourist, and he went into a bookstore and bought a book, carried a bag with the bookstore name on it. So he looked for all the world like a tourist. So a couple of prostitutes approached him, but they weren't really pressing. But one who did was named Mary Martino. And we could hear it in the car. She says, hi there, just in town? Yes. Do you want to have a good time? No, I'm fine. No, come on, I'll show you a really good time. And it goes on and on. And the sergeant sitting in the car said, that's it, arrest her. So we tore up in the police car and pulled up beside her. And the detective I was sitting with jumped out of the car to arrest her. His name is George Hake. And I always knew that when he got excited, he had a stammer. And he was excited then. So I opened the door of the car and pulled up beside Mary Martino, and he said, Mary, you're under arrest.
That's hilarious.
She said, what for? He said, for soliciting. Oh, no. So they took her in. And I didn't use any of her conversation because that would have been evidence.
Right.
But I did use conversations from other confrontations with prostitutes. And that resulted in the prosecutor, Bruce Donald, thinking I was using evidence. And he raised heck with the police chief. And when this tape ran, I was out of town on vacation. And when I got back, my boss, Warren Barker, phoned me and he said, police department's really upset. He said, you better give the chief a call. So I called him and I said, hi, Don, it's George Garrett. Oh, George, yeah. I said, I'm in Hawaii. Should I stay here? I wasn't. And he said, wouldn't be a bad idea. He said, what did you do? And I said, I ran a tape. Was not evidence. He said, it wasn't the evidence of the case that we were prosecuting? I said, no. Oh, good. You've done nothing wrong. So that was fine. Okay. And same project, last night on the job, I was with some uniformed guys in a police car. An accident at 70th and Granville, possible impaired driver. As we arrived, I saw this very distinguished looking gentleman with his Homburg hat and his full coat staggering beside his damaged Chrysler. And I said to the policeman, do you know who that is? No. I said, that's Mr. Justice E. Davy Fulton. Oh, call a supervisor. Here they are with a reporter and a judge. What do they do? So they issued him a 24-hour suspension, and they were going to take him home in the police car and impound his car. And I was standing right beside him with the tape recorder in full view, and he said, and he was clipped tones in his voice, quite familiar. He said, very well, if you prefer these charges against me, I shall not be a judge any longer. So I thought, well, there's a good quote. And then as they're putting him in the police car, they have to put his head down a bit. And they said, get in the car, sir. He said, no, I won't. Go to hell. So the headline the next day was, no to hell, go to hell, judge tells cops. So it was very embarrassing for poor old Judge
Fulton. Judge Fulton.
Yeah.
A while back, you mentioned the name Gary Bannerman. Now, seeing that you were like a mainstay with NW, there are many names, well, not just radio, but press. Some of the names that comes to mind for anyone that's been in Vancouver all through like 1950s, 60s, names such as Denny Boyd, Pat Burns, Jack Webster, Rafe Mayer, Fanny Kiefer, Jack Cullen, Bill Good Jr., Jack Cullen. And
knew them all.
those are some legends.
Yeah, there was a period in Vancouver radio, I would think from the 50s through the 80s, possibly into the 90s, where CKNW was a dominant station, and there were other very high-profile broadcasters. Pat Burns, you mentioned.
Yes.
He was a brilliant broadcaster. He was a newsman first. I recall doing a story one night about a new Canadian minesweeper being commissioned, and I'm working for CKNW, and he's working for CKLG at the time, and we saw each other somewhere, and he said, that story you did about the minesweeper? I said, yes. Very dull. He said, what you should have said was, 1,000 new eyes are watching the Canadian West Coast, thanks to this new minesweeper or whatever, or destroyer. So I would take a little bits of advice from him. You know.
So you did not feel slighted by his comments at all?
No, not at all. And then I worked with Rafe Mayer quite a bit. He dubbed me the intrepid reporter.
Yes.
I had to go look it up.
Why did that? What? Because you just never gave up, or you just persistent?
Well, it's supposed to be one who's unafraid.
Or just generally a pain in the rear kind of reporter.
Yeah,
just doesn't give up.
Yeah, and go after it, you know. And
like a bulldog.
Don't worry about the consequences. But the one thing they used to say about me is, you never know what Garrett's doing because he'll always give you that toothy smile, and you don't know if he's going to do a number on you or what he's going to do. You know, but I try to be fair to people.
So it's Rafe Mayer that called you the intrepid reporter.
Oh yes, and I got along well with Rafe. At times we used to do a Friday wrap up of what happened during the week, didn't have much to do with investigative reporting, but it gave us a chance to debate things. And once in a while we'd disagree. But I saw him, took him for lunch about a month ago, and he's doing okay.
Good. You have another moniker, gentleman reporter. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I used to dress quite well. Lori, my daughter, will attest to that. That I always felt that I should be properly dressed.
Even though we can't see you on
That's right,
radio.
yeah. And I would wear a sports jacket and sports white shirt and a tie, and properly pressed slacks, polished shoes. I always felt it's part of the responsibility you have when you're going into courtrooms, when you're dealing with police. In those days, detectives wore a shirt and tie, and they respected you for it. And they would tell me sometimes, so-and-so would get a lot more respect from us if he dressed properly. It was the standard, and it's gone by the way now, but that's sort of my training, I guess.
So now you're retired, fully retired, or are you doing side things?
No, I'm retired. I did a little bit of writing for the Surrey Hospital Foundation. I'd been on the foundation for a few years. I was on the Jack Webster Foundation, which is for quality journalism. I'm very proud of that, and of the hospital. And at one time, I was on the board of the Justice Institute in New Westminster. So all worthwhile things. But now I'm finished with all of that.
So you haven't taken up like travel, golfing, bridge?
Take up golfing, not very well. My grandson beat me the other day, badly. But I have an easy life, really.
Did I read somewhere that you had at one time you had a business called George Garrett Consulting? Is that right?
I did.
You did.
I did some consulting after I retired.
What was that all about?
Helping people deal with the media. The media call it the dark side.
Oh.
You've gone over to the dark side, And I helped train people answering questions. And we used to say that the most important thing is not the question, it's the answer. That's why you'll see polished professionals will deal with a question, and you might as well have not even asked the question. They give you the answer they want to give. And if you're an interviewer, you have to steer them back on and get some answer to what you want,
It sounds like the Toronto police could use your help these days.
Oh, could they ever? But, in this day and age, a lot of it is about what they call spinning your side of the story, trying to evade a direct answer. In British Columbia, it's very difficult for investigative reporters to get information through what's called privacy information, and they try to hide it. So it's a rather difficult job at times.
Well, George, it's been a pleasure to have you join me in my studios today. But before I let you go, I want to close off with another quote, if I may.
Right.
And it goes like this. Quote, "It is rare in the media business, like any other, to praise a competitor. But George Garrett is a rare competitor. In fact, Mr. Garrett belongs to all of us in a way few attained. He's had the grace to help more than one new or late arriving reporter to catch up on a story right after filing his own story. He is a class act. His kindness and, yes, old-fashioned gentlemanness is as legendary as his industry and his insatiable curiosity. He's maintained both the trust of his contacts and professional objectivity, the recipe for routinely scooping stories. When he retires, CKNW will have lost a great voice, and the rest of the media will praise him unstintingly, and they will breathe a secret sigh of relief."
Pretty nice.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you. A pleasure.
This is Motorman Elwin with Radio BVM signing off.